Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people should be aware that this series may contain images, voices, or names of deceased persons.
This episode, The Anzac Legend, is part of the series that examines the concept of nation. It begins in Sydney, takes you across to the garden city of Adelaide, and concludes in the nation's war memorial in Canberra. We'll interrogate the enduring attraction of Anzac, its impact on the Australian character and identity, and we'll examine a forgotten war, still at the very heart of our history.
This is the Anzac Memorial in Hyde Park, Sydney. It's a monument built to the Australian losses of the Great War of 1914 to 1918. Many Australians would tell you that this event signified the birth of the nation, and yet many historians would tell you that that's an astonishing claim.
Now, technically, our country becomes a nation in 1901. That's when the Commonwealth of Australia is born. That's when 6 separate colonies become one nation. But of course, we remain a dominion of Great Britain. So when we go to war in 1914, we do so as loyal Britons. Some would argue that far from Australia coming of age in the Great War, it destroyed many of the things that made us so distinctive as a nation. The massive cost of sending an army overseas stifled a program of progressive legislation, education, pensions, the right to vote and earn a decent wage, advanced experimental legislation that had made us a social laboratory for the world. In the Great War, Australians lost that youthful idealism. And far from the Great War uniting a nation, it tore us apart. In 1916 and again in 1917, Australians fought over fiercely contested conscription referenda. Australia, during World War I, was a bitterly divided society, at war with the world and at war with itself.
So why do Australians persist in seeing Anzac Day as the birth of the nation? And what does the word Anzac actually mean?
Well, it's an acronym. It's telegraphic shorthand for the Australian New Zealand Army Corps. That's the first trans-Tasman fighting force to leave the shores of Australia and New Zealand. And the Anzac's first battle was fought at a place we now call Anzac Cove. It's on the Gallipoli Peninsula in Turkey, and that battle was fought on the 25th of April, 1915. Really, it was less a battle than a bloodbath. The Ottoman Empire was an ally of Germany, and landing at the Dardanelles, the Anzacs faced stubborn Turkish resistance. Australian and New Zealand troops advanced no further than a narrow beachhead. They dug in, and they died. Over 8 months of the Gallipoli campaign, thousands of young men were killed on the peninsula. And that was a crippling blow to families and communities across Australasia. And you can visualise something of that terrible loss here in the heart of this great memorial. Each of those stars represents a man or a woman who went to war. Thousands never came home again. Australia and New Zealand would lose more men in that war per head of population than any other allied nation. That was a crippling loss to so many communities. And arguably with those men died something else. With them died an unquestioning faith in empire.
And yet, significantly, Anzac has come to be viewed not as defeat, but as victory, as a triumph of character over adversity. The Anzacs held on despite everything being stacked against them. And if we failed at Gallipoli, that failure wasn't seen as any fault of our own. Nationhood is always defined through opposition, and at Gallipoli, we've come to think of ourselves as the victims of British interests and British incompetence. What most people forget is that more British troops would die on Gallipoli than Australians, and it was an Allied campaign, and Australia and New Zealand were only one part of it.
Anzac's a contested memory then. It means different things to different people. But few would deny that the Great War changed how Australians saw themselves. We had fought in imperial wars before. Colonial contingents rallied around the empire in the relief of Khartoum and the Boer War in South Africa. But at Gallipoli, men fought not as Victorians or New South Welshmen, but as Australians. And at Anzac and other theatres of the Great War, Dominion troops came to contrast themselves with those of the so-called mother country. Australian soldiers, many volunteers from the bush, were said to be taller and stronger than conscripts from the slums of Manchester or London. A class-bound society, Britain created soldiers trained to obey. Australian soldiers, many claimed, were resourceful, confident, fiercely independent in their outlook, and really quite attractive to the ladies. Cartoons of the day celebrate the diggers' larrikin flair. This was the legendary bushman in uniform.
Many of those ideas actually run counter to the evidence. Most of the Australian imperial force had been raised in cities and towns. Many, in fact, had been born in Britain. But Australia's foundation myth, like the foundation myths of other nations, owed more to mythology than it did to history. And Gallipoli itself seemed to set the stage for a legend. The country around Anzac is rugged, impenetrable, rather like much of the Australian bush, and very, very different to the flat, killing fields of Flanders or the Somme. It's also a landscape that stirred powerful emotions. Not far from where the Anzacs landed on the Dardanelles, Hector fought the great battles of Troy. The Great War was one of the most industrialised wars of modern times, and yet it was read through the potent prism of this classical imagery.
All things considered then, it's probably not surprising that Anzac, the Great War in its entirety, is seen by many as the birth of the nation. And the 25th of April, the day of the Gallipoli landing, more of a national day than the 26th of January. That last problematic date marked the sad beginnings of a convict colony here in Sydney. Anzac, on the other hand, represented the day Australia stepped onto the world stage, escaping what many called the convict stain of its colonial past, enduring, surely, a baptism of fire.
Anzac might seem like a myth that privileges men, and yet here at the Anzac Memorial, right in the centre, is this remarkable sculpture by Raynor Hoff called Sacrifice. Raynor was a veteran himself, and he'd seen far too much of war to ever want to glorify it. But arguably, this memorial doesn't pay tribute to martial virtues. It embodies loss. Those three figures, a wife, a mother, a daughter, carry a slain soldier on his shield. He's far from the usual caricature of an Anzac, some sort of superhuman warrior. This man is a victim rather than a fighter. His nakedness connotes his vulnerability. And perhaps this memorial embodies another message as well. The cost of war isn't confined to the men sent to fight it. Its pain is carried by families and communities as well.
Raynor Hoff's compelling sculpture is our object for this week's episode. And really, memorials like this one are scattered all across the Australian landscape. It's been argued that Australians raise more war memorials per head of population than any other nation in the world. And the question for us really is why? To answer that question, we'll be travelling thousands of kilometres from here to South Australia and the Women's Memorial Gardens in Adelaide.
This is Adelaide, the capital of South Australia and one of the country's most beautiful cities. Adelaide is known as the City of Churches, but it's also a vibrant centre of the arts, the gateway to the Barossa Valley, and a metropolis ringed by gardens and lakes and parks.
Within just a kilometre of here, we found no fewer than 4 major war memorials. Another Raynor Hoff, South Australia's State Memorial. A monument to Australia's black diggers. And this tribute to Simpson and his donkey, the Great War's humblest hero, a medic who carried the wounded to safety on the perilous slopes of Gallipoli.
This is the 4th memorial we've found today, and it's the most eloquent. Why? Because these women's memorial gardens, not far from Adelaide's great cathedral, answers that question we posed back in Sydney, which is, why are there so many war memorials raised the length and breadth of Australia?
You know, it's not just the scale of the carnage, though that was terrible enough. In the early 20th century, and still today, laying a body to rest is an integral part in the whole process of mourning. Time-honoured rituals revolved around a loved one's physical remains, empowering families in the face of loss, offering solace and sometimes acceptance. But unlike France or the United States, who repatriated their war dead, Australia's fallen were buried overseas. And unlike Great Britain, those graves were oceans and oceans away, not just a short trip across the Channel.
Most Australians could never afford to visit battlefields or cemeteries overseas, so they had no way of physically connecting with the faraway lands and places that had claimed their loved ones. All they could do was imagine them.
And so it's not surprising, really, that the Women's Memorial Gardens here in Adelaide takes the form of a graveyard. Flower beds of roses are made out to resemble plots. They're symbolising actual graves in France or Gallipoli, Palestine or Belgium. A stone of remembrance lies at one end of these gardens, a cross of sacrifice at the other. Those same memorial forms mark the Great War's cemeteries all across Europe. So, by walking through this garden of remembrance, families felt the presence of those distant dead. This place enabled a kind of imaginary pilgrimage.
And so too, in a sense, does every war memorial. Whatever form they took, obelisk or arch, a cross or a statue, all these war memorials had one thing in common. All were called a cenotaph, literally an empty grave. These were the surrogate tombs of loved ones, buried thousands of miles away. They offered a place to grieve and a focus for our mourning. And one of the largest and grandest of these memorials lies at the very heart of the nation.
Well, you might have expected an episode that deals with the Anzac Legend to end here. It's the Australian War Memorial, and it's placed in the very centre of one of the great sightlines that defines the shape of our national capital, Canberra. The memorial was built to commemorate Australia's appalling sacrifice in World War I, but it's become the site where all the wars in which our country has fought are both honoured and remembered.
Gallery after gallery deals with both world wars and the conflicts that follow them. The Cold War battles of Korea and Vietnam, recent campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan, peacekeeping operations, and now what's being called the War on Terror. And the museum also commemorates conflicts Australians died in before we became a nation. The South African War, the Boxer Rebellion, and the war in the Sudan. Here, the list of all our war dead is solemnly commemorated, gleaming in bronze, over 100,000 names.
But there's one war we have yet to speak of. It's a war of dispossession that marked the very foundation of Australia. A war that claimed the lives of thousands and was fought from one end of this continent to the other. And that war is remembered here, in the National Museum of Australia.
Almost 100 years to the day after the landing on Gallipoli, the National Museum of Australia unveiled a memorial to honour Pemulwuy, an Aboriginal warrior who bravely resisted the European invasion of his country. This plaque was placed here. For over a decade, Pemulwuy fought a guerrilla war against white settlers around Sydney, burning their crops, attacking their soldiers, rallying Bidjigal people. He was killed by the British in 1802. His head was severed from his body, preserved in spirits and sent off to England. Pemulwuy's head was seen as a kind of trophy, symbolising the colonialist conquest of Aboriginal Australia. What this plaque reminds us is that Aboriginal people never ceded their sovereignty. Then, as today, they fought to preserve their culture and their country. That undeclared war against Indigenous peoples has long been a silence in the way white Australians remember their past. We commemorate a landing on the coast of Gallipoli 100 years ago and too often disregard the war fought here at a far greater human cost in this very country.
In 2015, the National Museum declared the beginnings of Pemulwuy's resistance war as one of the defining moments of our nation's history. It's no less important than the storming of the Dardanelles in 1915, or the bombing of Darwin by Japanese aircraft in 1942, or the Vietnam moratorium of the 1970s. Now that was a people's movement against war and against conscription. So you see, war has been pivotal in shaping Australia's past. And how we choose to remember those wars will help to define who we are well into the future. If you'd like to learn more about the issues raised in this episode, why not catch Susan Carland in Conversation? This time, Susan introduces a conversation between myself and Beck Wheatley, a graduate student at Monash University.